Hello, and this is
Hello.
Mary Page from Chicago. Welcome to this week's Rights in Russia interview on the situation for human rights defenders in Russia. Today, our guest is Dmitry Makarov from the Moscow Helsinki Group, also a member of the Coordinating Council of the International Youth Human Rights Movement. He has led courses and trained human rights defenders in Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, Kazakhstan, and Kyrgyzstan, and provided legal assistance to grassroots activist groups. Thank you for joining us, Dmitry, and
Hello.
sharing your views to help us better understand the environment for working on human rights issues in Russia. I have some questions that I'd like to pose to frame our interview, which we hope to complete in about 30 minutes. So if you're ready, let's get started with my first question.
Okay, let's do it.
Okay, here we go. To what degree are human rights organizations, such as the Moscow Helsinki Group, still able to function and be effective?
Well, when we talk about human rights in Russia, of course, I mean, the first associations that come to mind are crackdowns, politically motivated arrests, situation with torture, with prisoners, and so on. But I would like to focus on the other side of it. Despite all those negative trends, there is still a vibrant civil society, which I think counterintuitively is going to be more and more influential. It is already becoming more and more influential in the state of things in Russia and outside of Russia. So in that sense, human rights organizations do have an impact. They continue to influence things, and I think there'll be more to come. Moscow Helsinki Group, of course, enjoys some sort of a special status due to its historical legacy, in a way. But there are many other renowned groups, the ones that burgeoned just recently and that have an impact very much so, like Over the Info, Apologia Protesta, if we're talking about reaction to mass protests, but also about some systemic issues like torture, like deaths in custody, or like prisoners' rights, and so on. And there are a number of various new initiatives that keep on appearing as well.
Speaking of the Moscow Helsinki Group, which you say has a special status because it's been there for so long, has it continued to pursue the goals that it had when it was founded? That was nearly 45 years ago, right? In 1976.
Yeah,
And if not, how has it changed?
yeah, on May 12th to be precise. So in less than a month, we'll be celebrating 45th
Okay.
anniversary in that sense. So I think it's kind of funny for me to say that because, of course, that was long before my time, and those are the stories that I read in books. But in a way, then I was propelled into the position first of a member and then one of the co-chairs. I felt that burden of legacy and historical things coming onto me. But I still think that the mission holds true. The mission is speaking truth to power, and the mission is to support civil society. And now, as I said in the first my response, there is much more civil society to support, and there's also civil society that can provide support and feedback. So in that sense, I think our mission has not changed. We are keeping a wide profile. We're not focusing on any single human rights violations. We are trying to monitor the general situation. We are trying sometimes to serve as an intermediary. It's not only about speaking truth to power, but it's also trying to make power listen. It's a bit of a different function. And I think Lyudmila Alexeyeva has embodied that spirit for many years. And I think it is still very much important, especially when the tensions escalate and the society tends to enhance its divisions. So I think that's the second large part of our mission. And then the third one, which I already mentioned, is support to various groups outside of Moscow and also outside of Russia, because we think that civil society and Moscow Helsinki Group as a part of it is a part of a larger grouping of international civil society. And in a sense, it's very important for us to keep that spirit of international solidarity and to continue those links, especially with the post-Soviet, so-called post-Soviet space, but also beyond that too. So that would be the third large part of the mission. And then the fourth that I may mention, which may be something new, relatively new, although I think somehow it was present definitely since the 90s. It's raising awareness about human rights, talking about how important it is, perhaps nowadays in a different language and in different media, through social media, through videos, through comic books, through animation. This is the new language and the new media that we use, but the message is still the same. And it is important that it concerns everyone and that any civilized community, civilized state, holds human rights to be important.
If you had to guess, how many groups is the Moscow Helsinki Group in touch with via these different means?
It would be hard to estimate because I mean, of course, there is those are the ones who are in the spotlight because they are Moscow based or because they are so professional and single issue focused and so on. But there are also different grassroots initiatives. For example, just a while ago, a group of MHG members responded to the another appeal of initiative group of how to say it, truck drivers, you know, the ones that were protesting a while ago. I mean, they still have issues that concern them around their kind of interests. So they came to an assistance. We have a free labor union of journalists just now asking for help on a number of cases. We have different groups that are working on prisoners' rights. Sometimes it's former prisoners also who look for assistance. So it would be very hard to estimate actually. So I mean, and I don't want to say a number because that number would probably prioritize the groups of whom we have long-term established relations and so on. But I would say several dozens definitely.
So that leads me to my next question, which is about community support. How much community support do human rights organizations have across Russia? What's your perspective on that?
You know, a while ago, I found myself caught in myself noticing myself and my colleagues caught in, you know, besiege fortress mentality. You know, there's a hostile society around us that hates our guts, that probably would attack us. Perhaps the state is actually more liberal. And now I realize more and more how wrong I was in that perspective. And it's a good thing that I didn't allow it to catch onto me and somehow switched. And I find it a lot more resourceful to focus on, you know, my parents of my son's classmates that say, we don't really understand what you're doing, but we know it's important things for our country and keep up. So, and those are small signals like I said, kept on popping up once I switched, you know, the mentality. So I think there's enormous amount of support. It's just not, we're not yet able to capitalize it. And the society is learning to frame it in that way. But there's enormous demand for justice. There's enormous demand to be heard. And we can see it, of course, through the lenses of street protests that are sometimes, you know, over mediatized. But it's also in kind of everyday things. I think there's a growing understanding that the relations with the state have to change somehow. And this is where human rights organizations, human rights defenders can play a role. And if we manage to send our message more clearly, not to be just experts who publish reports, but the support will come. And it is already coming in many aspects. I mean, volunteer engagement is on the rise, crowdfunding as well. Of course, I mean, I don't want to paint an overly optimistic picture because all these trends come also as a response to an enormous retaliation. And we are fighting not only the state repressive apparatus, but also the apathy and the disillusionment that it tries to instill into us and into the society as a whole.
And so in that vein, what are some of the risks that human rights defenders face in doing their work?
Well, I mean, I would say that examples of more and more colleagues getting real prison sentence is a vivid reminder of risks, as well as a list of colleagues who were killed for human rights work, being lawyers working on Northern Caucasus or journalists reporting on different abuses and so on. So those are kind of constant reminders of the risks. And there's also all sorts of what is called, the term that I don't really like, the shrinking civic space, you know, all the legislation that actually makes organizing and makes talking, engaging people, and makes, you know, gathering together more and more difficult. So just, I mean, I'm right now involved in consulting and supporting a number of various regional-based groups that work to organize around the consequences of protests. And of course, I mean, it's a pity to see a large number of very good-hearted young people getting kind of prison sentences, even if they measure in weeks or in days. It's still prison sentence. So those are all kind of reminders of the risks. But despite of that, I mean, people keep on committing themselves to that type of work. So I would say that aside from repression, the biggest risk is not believing that the change is possible. So.
Okay, very nice. You've touched on this a little in the beginning of our conversation, but I wanted to go back to the Western media and how the picture that it paints of human rights in Russia, which is a very gloomy picture. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit about how the media portrays human rights and the Western media, and how that might not be an accurate picture.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very complicated and very good question, actually, because I think the media in general and the Western media in particular, I mean, it tends to paint, you know, the picture in terms of there's the aggressor, there's victims, the society being a victim, and those are the heroes or the saviors that are there, be it Navalny as the ultimate hero figure, or be it the human rights defenders that kind of fight despite all the odds. And I think it's oversimplifies things also. I think much more interesting is to look at how not the heroes, but the society itself changes. So, I mean, I had a very interesting talks. I mean, it's not that much about media, but it is by talks with students or young activists in Western Europe, who of course are influenced by the media. Of course, I mean, the main association of Russia, especially in terms of human rights, is Putin, right? He's the epitome of Russia. I'd say that we should not talk about Putin. We should talk about what we as societies can do together about issues that concern us. So in that sense, I would like the media to portray not only, you know, the large events like the imprisonment of a leading opposition figure or the brave people going out into the streets, but also kind of more mundane things, but that matter. I mean, the enormous number of activists that work to have laws on domestic violence changed, or brave lawyers that try to tackle all the courts with less than 1% actually acquittal rate, right? Or the ones that volunteer groups that mobilize to support protesters. I mean, those are the stories that are going on and that are not necessarily centered on heroes or on saviors. This is a society finding its voice, finding its dignity in many ways. So, but I mean, of course, media by its nature probably would not be able to encompass all of that. But in person-to-person dialogue, I think we can transmit that, and I would wish that more and more those kind of civil society voices would be heard, not just the politician, the think tankers, the the public intellectuals, and so on.
Great. Is it possible to say what impact U.S. or EU foreign policy can have on human rights?
Yeah, I mean, it could be subject of a long discussion, of course, because in many ways, of course, I don't know how to answer that shortly, because they of course many people still look up to the EU and to the US as the countries that should voice their concern and go beyond that in convincing the Russian government to change its approach to human rights. But I think more and more people are not looking into that and not believing that the change can come from that type of pressure. And I think that's one of the departure points from the dissident era, which in the logic of the Cold War did look onto the West as a source of influence, as a source of impact. We live in a much more complicated world where this value of human rights in many ways was devalued also by many actions of the US and the EU governments. And so in that sense, of course, we engage with EU diplomats, we engage with US diplomats, especially at the multilateral institutions like the UN, the Council of Europe, the OEC. And I think this is where the efforts of that policy should be directed, not towards politically motivated and politically framed sanctions of any sort, but towards strengthening human rights institutions that should be not only about sanctions, but also about institutional influence, institutional power. I mean, if we compare the amount of money that EU and puts into Council of Europe, it's minuscule compared to what it puts into trade, or what it puts into, I don't know, even translation. And with the US, it's the same. The US also prefers bilateral leverage rather than investing in courts, international courts, into universal jurisdiction, into various ways to truly sanction human rights violators, not just put their names on a list and freeze their assets.
And thinking ahead now, what do you think the future holds for human rights in Russia?
Well, I mean, of course, there are two ways to go. Or like in the fairy tales, there are three ways. The warrior, brave warrior, comes to a crossroads. So in that sense, we are actually feeling that we are, if we're not yet at the crossroads, we are very close to it. So I believe, and that's an optimist in me speaking, that Russia is already part of the European family. And it's, of course, part of a civilization that created human rights as an intellectual product. So I think the current events is just a diversion, and we will once more kind of join that magistral path. But of course, that path might not be straight, and the crossroads, it might not be the only crossroads. So I think we are in for a long battle. It will not end during this upcoming election. It will not end in the next term of President Putin. It's a long way struggle. In that sense, I mean, the history, the 45-year history of the Moscow Helsinki Group does give that other perspective. I think that regimes come and go, but the importance of organizations and people talking and working for human rights will stay. So I think we'll have the work, all of us will have the work out for us, but at the end, we are bound to succeed.
So before we end, I'd just like to ask you a personal question, and that is, what led you to do this kind of work in the first place?
Well, I mean, to make a long story short, I think at some point I wanted to be in a field that allows for societal change in a way, and allows to be kind of free in a way. So I started as an activist. I was actually environmental activist and anti-fascist activist, and I also worked as a lawyer in a public reception office. And I thought that human rights gives me a language in which I can talk to different people and different groups, and gives me an instrument of impact. So, I mean, that realization had led me to it, and also a number of people that I met along the way. I mean, you mentioned youth human rights movement in the beginning. I mean, I have to correct you. I'm no longer the member of the co-chair of the coordinating council, because it ceased to exist. But in a way, I mean, it has, with my story and with the story of many other young people, it has succeeded in engaging us into human rights by introducing us to the historical legacy. And Moscow Helsinki Group was part of it, actually, and also Western figures like Martin Luther King, and that whole ethos was part of it. But on the other hand, saying that those are not some distant heroes, and those are not some historical stories. This is about your life. This is what is evolving, and you can have an impact, and you have other people to build on, and this sense of kind of community in a way has also led me to continue on that.
Well, that's a very inspirational story, Dmitry. I wish we had more time, but I'm afraid our 30 minutes now is up and we need to end. But I want to thank you for this very stimulating and optimistic conversation. And
surprisingly enough, for me too. But yes, we have to be reluctant but persistent optimists.
Yes, I agree.